So we're hearing from the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark was the first Gospel written of the four. Even though in the canons of the Bible it goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark was written before Matthew and Luke and is very concise. Mark is very to the point. And in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, it was written some 60-odd years after Jesus' resurrection, 50 years or so. We hear in the very first chapter, Jesus gets baptized by John in the River Jordan. He then is called into the wilderness, where he spends 40 days in reflection and meditation and being tempted by Satan. And coming out of the wilderness, the next thing he does is he goes out and he calls his friends. He said, I need help. So he identifies a group of people and he calls his disciples to follow him, and they drop their nets and they follow Jesus immediately. So calling his disciples, he says, I think I should just go and recenter myself. So he goes to the synagogue in Capernaum on the Sabbath. He goes to church and he teaches. And the people who were there were amazed by his words. So Jesus is there to recenter himself and meditate, and in the course of all of that, something significant happens. Now, before I get to that significant moment, what strikes me more than anything else is that he didn't waste any time. He got right to it. And the first thing that occurred to me was, how often in my life have I said to myself, I really should ... The injustices I see going on in the world, I should get out there and do this. I should work at reducing poverty and homelessness in our nation. I should work at ensuring that racism is not as pervasive. I should work at ... And then I get home and I get comfy. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next week. When I have time. When I retire. I will get around to doing those things. I would like a show of hands of how many of you have had that experience in your life. Thank you. I feel much better now. It is part of our human condition. Because to engage, to respond as Jesus did to that situation takes courage and energy and single-mindedness and commitment, and is frightening sometimes because you are going out of your comfort zone. Jesus didn't do as I so effectively do, procrastinate. Got on with it. To me, the first message is, in order to be the hands and the heart and the feet of the church of the world, we can't wait. We need to respond as issues and situations confront us in life. So the significant thing that he did was he was in the midst of the worship service. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a man who was, quote, possessed by a demon. Now, there are those of us who may believe in devil possession. There are those of us who may believe that the scriptures in those days, they referenced demon possession as an umbrella to deal with issues of mental health and so on. However you want to interpret that, I will leave it to you. But the reality is that there was someone who was disturbed deeply. And the interesting thing about it is the fact that Jesus, for who he is as the Son of God, the Incarnation of God in the world, is recognized first and foremost by this individual. The first person, as he begins his work, that recognizes him for who he is the man who is dealing with mental health issues. Often it may be the case that in our day and age, the people who live with faith in the face of tragedy, in the face of deep trials and tribulations are the ones that cling most closely to the love and the care and the confidence of a merciful God. I told this story before, but I just want to remind you again because it was so indicative of how we as an institution can behave on occasion. And that was the day in which, in a former parish in which I worked, the rector of the parish at the time had thought he would really make an impact, and he had a person who he knew quite well come to the church dressed as a street person. And this woman, she came up the steps of the church and she was wearing ragged clothing and she was dragging a shopping cart. She came into the church and there was a moat of space around her as she sat talking to herself prior to the service beginning. And so my friend stood up in the pulpit and began to talk about justice and compassion and mercy for those who are downtrodden and struggling in life. And she stands up in the middle of the service and says, "Not on your life. Look at me. I sit by myself. Nobody speaks to me." Well, the congregation is bristling with tension and nervousness. And one man yells out, "Sit down and let him talk." And she continues to heckle Michael, his name was. Continues to heckle Michael in the pulpit. And other people come and say, "Come with me. Let's go outside. Let's go and I'll get you a coffee." And she says, "No, I want to stay here." So eventually, over time, the woman is escorted out to the hall where she's placated and patronized, frankly. Michael finishes his sermon. He comes and sits down beside me, and I was up in the sanctuary with him, and he turns to me and says, "Now what am I going to do?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "That was a setup." Well, he told the congregation the next week, and they were both surprised, angered, disappointed, and shocked, and all sorts of emotions. But the point was that we, sometimes as a church, we miss it. Jesus didn't miss it. The people who were around Jesus after he exorcised the demon from this man, they said, "What is this? What is he doing? How can he command authority of even the spirits?" They didn't understand. They missed the point of what he was doing. That the God that he brought to us in himself was a God who was a healer, a compassionate healer, that embraced all peoples, regardless of who they are and the backgrounds from which they came. Jesus used a variety of ways to bring wholeness and healing to the broken and the marginalized. And he calls us, as followers of him, to likewise bring wholeness and healing to a world that is so broken, where there are so many that live in isolation and are marginalized and are lonely and are homeless and are hungry and are dealing with mental health issues, and yet sometimes we sit here and worship and go from our place back to our places of residence and work, and we say, "Tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow." We're called to be individuals and churches, to be God's companions along the journey of life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And our churches are called to be a prophetic voice that so desperately needs to hear good news, where we can live in unity and togetherness. God's inspiration within our community is one in which we sometimes tend to put on the back burner and miss. But there are so many people around us that are in desperate need of hearing the good news of Christ, the healer, the one of wholeness, love, and compassion. Thanks be to God.